The number was already there. That was the thing I could not explain. Standing in the corridor outside the deposition room, with Tayce Morrow's voice still running through my head from the last 3 hours of watching her work. Precise, unhurried, surgical in the way that had made her the most dangerous litigator in the city before she was 35. I was looking at my phone because my phone had buzzed, which was not unusual, and the contact name on the screen was Tayce. Just Tayce. First name only, saved in the way you save someone when you are not being careful. I had no memory of saving it that way. I had no memory of saving it at all. If you want to hear uncensored, too hot for YouTube stories, check out my Patreon in the description. Tell us where you are watching from and subscribe. The history between Tayce Morrow and me was not complicated. It was very simple and very clean, and the kind of simple, clean thing that people call a rivalry when they are being generous, and a fixation when they are being honest. We had first appeared across from each other in a courtroom 4 years ago when I was 27 years old and still new enough to the work that the conference rooms at Prescott and Vale, where Tayce was already a senior associate on the partner track, felt like the inside of a building I had not yet earned the right to be in. She had been sitting at the opposing counsel table in a blue-gray suit that cost more than I made in a month, reading a document she had already memorized, and when she looked up and registered me across the room, the look had been neither dismissive nor particularly interested. It had been the look of someone noting a variable they had already accounted for. I had not accounted for her. That was my first mistake. The case was a securities matter, a class action related to a corporate merger that had allegedly misrepresented material financial terms to retail investors. My client was the lead plaintiff's firm. Tayce's firm, Prescott and Vale, represented the corporate defendant. The litigation had been running for 18 months before I came onto the case, and what I inherited from the outgoing associate was a discovery record that was technically complete and strategically hollow, a set of exhibit binders that told the story of the fraud, without any theory of what to do with the story once you had it, and a sense accumulated over 3 conversations with the supervising partner that the case was going to lose. I spent 6 weeks rebuilding the theory. I argued for a different framing of the damages model, a narrower class definition that paradoxically made the case stronger, and a trial strategy built around 3 documents that everyone else had dismissed as duplicative, and I had recognized as the specific financial thread that tied the entire scheme together. It was not enough. Tayce found the thread before I had the chance to pull it, found it by a legal analysis of the underlying derivative contracts that I had not thought to run, and by the time we reached the summary judgment phase, she had stripped 2/3 of my damages theory from the record and left me with a case that was true and unprovable in equal measure. She won. I lost. The ruling was correct by the law as written. The law as written was insufficient to the actual harm done. I reviewed the case brief again 6 months later, and again at 18 months. And once more, on a Tuesday night the previous fall, sitting alone in the Harwick and Stern library with a cold coffee and the sound of rain on the windows. Because I had been working a case with a derivative contract structure that reminded me of the Meridian matter and wanted to understand again what I had missed. Tayce Morrow had not been in that room with me. She was almost always, in some form, in that room with me. I was 31 years old and a senior associate at Harwick and Stern, which was the kind of firm that took difficult cases for good money when bigger firms declined them for reputational reasons, and which had a reputation for the kind of litigation that left marks even when it lost. Gia Sato, the senior partner who had recruited me out of my second firm 3 years ago, described our practice as consequentialist. You picked the cases that mattered. You built the theories that were correct, rather than convenient. You lost sometimes, and you learned from the losing, and you came back with a better theory next time. I had come back with better theories. I had won more than I had lost over 3 years at Harwick and Stern. I had built the specific kind of reputation that is made of specific wins in specific courtrooms, rather than the size of the retainer, and Gia had been quietly positioning me for the partnership track in a way I was not supposed to know about, and definitely knew about. I was good at my job. I had worked, over 4 years, to become good enough that the name Tayce Morrow in an opposing counsel filing produced something other than the specific interior contraction it had produced at 27. It produced, in its place, something sharper and more organized: anticipation, perhaps, or the professional equivalent of appetite. The knowledge that whoever I was facing across a table from her would require me to be better than I usually had to be, which was the version of a challenge I had, apparently, never learned to resist. All of which is context for what happened in March, when Gia Sato came to my office on a Thursday afternoon, sat in the chair across from my desk, and told me that Nexum Technologies had specifically requested co-counsel from both Harwick and Stern and Prescott and Vale on the defense of a new class action related to their most recent merger, and that Julian Park, the CEO, had specifically named both Sable Wren and Tace Morrow as the attorneys he wanted leading the engagement. I stared at her. Co-counsel with Prescott and Vale, I said. Co-counsel with Tace Morrow, Gia said, with the precision of a woman who had known me long enough to know the relevant variable. I picked up my coffee. The coffee was cold. I set it down. The Nexum retainer, I said, is very large, Gia said. Julian Park has money and very specific ideas about how to spend it. He wants the two of you in the same room, presumably because he has watched both of you win in rooms where the other side was paying for equivalent firepower, and he believes the mathematics work in his favor. They probably do, I said. They very likely do, Gia agreed. Which is why we are taking it. You have 60 days to tell me the arrangement is not workable. I do not expect you to use the 60 days. She left. I sat with the cold coffee and thought about Tace Morrow sitting in the blue-gray suit with the document she had already memorized, and the look she had given me across the courtroom 4 years ago, and the 2 seconds she took before answering a question she had decided to actually answer. I pulled out my phone. I opened a new contact. I typed Tace Morrow Prescott and Vale, and then I stopped and looked at what I had typed, and deleted everything after the T and saved it as Tace. I did not think about why I had done that. I put my phone in my pocket and went back to the brief I had been writing. That was March. The first strategy session was in April, at Prescott and Vale's offices, because they had the larger conference room and the better audiovisual setup for document review, and Tace had suggested it in the first email of the engagement with the impersonal efficiency of someone managing logistics rather than setting terms. I arrived 7 minutes before the meeting was scheduled, which was not late but was also not the first through the door, and Tace was already there. She was standing at the head of the table reviewing a document, her back 3/4 to the door, and she was not in a suit. She was in dark trousers and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled precisely once at the forearm, and her hair was very short, cut close to her head in a way I had always registered and had never had occasion to think about at close range, and the Prescott and Vale conference room was very well lit. She turned when I came in. She registered me in the single second she always used to register things, and then she pulled out the chair across from where she had been standing. Wren, she said. Morrow, I said. That was the full extent of the social register. We worked for 3 hours on the discovery timeline and the class certification response, and a damages framework that we were going to have to build jointly, and which neither of us wanted to cede the structural choices on. Felix Oren, Tace's associate, sat at the far end of the table with a notepad and the specific, careful attention of a young man who understood that the room he was in was operating on a frequency he should record and not interrupt. He was 28 and earnest in a way that was genuinely useful and was very clearly watching both of us with the peripheral intensity of someone who would have something to say about this later to someone he trusted. We disagreed on the damages framework within 40 minutes. I had a model that ran the class broadly and argued for the aggregate figure. Tace had a model that stratified the class by investment tier and argued that the stratified figure, while smaller, was legally cleaner and harder to challenge on appeal. The broad model is the persuasive one, I said. The broad model loses on appeal, she said. You win the verdict and lose the judgment. That is not a win. The stratified model requires the jury to do 2 kinds of math, and juries do not like 2 kinds of math. Good trial lawyers make math feel like narrative, she said. That is what you are going to do. That is what I am going to watch you do. I stared at her. There was something in the last sentence in the flat, specific way she had said it, in the small syntactic choice of, I am going to watch you do, rather than what we need to do or what the model requires, that sat differently than the rest of the sentence. She had moved on before I could decide what to do with it. We adopted the stratified model. I was right about the jury math and she was right about the appeal risk, and we both knew it and neither of us said so. The meeting ended at noon. Felix Oren gathered his materials with the organized dispatch of someone who knew better than to extend a room that was about to exhale. Tace was recapping a marker at the whiteboard, her back to me, and I was putting my tablet into my bag and thinking about nothing specific, and my phone was on the table face up. It buzzed. The screen lit up with a message from a number not yet in my contacts, reading, "The damages exhibit in the meridian matter, my analysis of the derivative contracts. I can forward it, if the structure is useful here. It would save you building from scratch." I looked at the message. I looked at the back of Tace Morrow's head. She turned around. She looked at her own phone on the table. She looked at me. "I noticed the parallel structure in your client's merger agreement," she said. "When Julian Park's team sent the file, you sent me a text message with your case analysis," I said. "The exhibit is 6 years old and not confidential," she said. "It is useful, or it is not. You could have emailed it through Felix." She picked up the marker she had just recapped, set it back in the tray, and met my eyes for one uncomplicated second. "I could have," she said. She left. I stood in the Prescott and Vale conference room holding my phone, and I looked at the message from the number she had texted from, and I saved it. I saved it as Tace, which was when I realized I already had a contact saved as Tace. From March. From the Thursday afternoon when Gia had told me about the engagement, and I had opened my phone and typed her name and deleted the rest. I looked at both entries. They had merged into one, the way duplicate contacts do, which meant my phone had recognized them as the same person and combined them quietly, without asking me whether I wanted them combined, on the reasonable assumption that I would. My phone had known. I had not told it. It had known anyway. I walked out of the Prescott and Vale offices and down to the street in the April air, and stood on the pavement outside the revolving doors, and thought about the word careful. About saving someone the way you save someone when you are not being careful. About a text sent directly, instead of through channels, because the direct route is the one you take when the message is really about something else. I called Gia. "How long is this engagement?" I asked. "Through verdict," she said. "Julian Park has allocated for approximately 18 months. 18 months, I said. "You sound like that is a problem." "It is not a problem," I said. "It is a very large amount of time." "Yes," Gia said, and I could hear in her voice that she knew exactly what the time meant and was choosing, with the precision of a woman who had been practicing law for 25 years, not to say any of it out loud. "Come by at 3. We will go through the retention terms." I put my phone in my pocket. On the screen, when I pulled it back out, the contact for Tace showed a last message, timestamp of 4 minutes ago, a derivative contract analysis from a case 6 years old, which was technically a professional communication, and was, for reasons I was not going to examine, at the corner of a Manhattan block in April, also something else entirely. There was a moment, driving back across town that April afternoon, when I made myself be honest about something. Not about Tace Morrow specifically, I was not ready for that conversation with myself yet, but about the engagement, about the fact that I had agreed to 18 months of twice-weekly strategy sessions with the one opposing attorney who had beaten me by finding the thread I should have found first, and that I had agreed to it without the 60-day review period Gia had offered, and that I had agreed to it within the same 24 hours I had saved a contact as Tace before having any professional reason to have the number. That was the honest version of how March went. I filed it and moved on. The pattern of the next 3 months was this: joint strategy sessions, twice a week, individual preparation on either side, in between, a shared document repository that both teams had access to and which generated a paper trail of edits and comments and revision histories that told the story of two people disagreeing professionally and then resolving the disagreement and, then, discovering a new disagreement, with the specific ongoing quality of people who find the argument more interesting than the resolution. I was right about the jury math. Tace was right about the appeal risk. We split the trial strategy down the middle in a way that neither of us would have achieved alone, and Julian Park, who sat in on the monthly status meetings with the focused attention of a man who had bought something expensive and was watching to see if it worked, said nothing useful at any of these meetings but looked, at the end of each one, slightly more satisfied than he had at the beginning. The sessions were professional. They were also, in some parallel register I was becoming less able to ignore, the most stimulating professional relationship I had had in the 4 years since Meridian. Taste disagreed with precision and specificity, never in the abstract, always about the exact mechanism of a specific legal argument. She read my analysis of the class certification record and returned it with 200 words of comments that improved 3 of my arguments and challenged one without overriding it, which was the behavior of someone who was investing in the work rather than managing around it. She sent 3 late-night texts over the first month. Always the same, a legal observation, a document she had pulled, a question about a specific exhibit that had a precise and answerable dimension, and also, in each case, an imprecise and unanswerable one. I answered the precise dimension each time and let the other sit. She let me let it sit. It was Gia who finally said anything. We were in her office at the end of June for a debrief on the class certification hearing, which had gone the way we had expected, which was to say, well, and Gia was reviewing the billing records with the careful attention she brought to every financial dimension of a case when she paused at the line items for the joint sessions. The strategy sessions are billing at a higher rate than projected, she said. They run long, I said. By how much? Average 45 minutes. Gia looked at the billing record. Then she looked at me. She had the particular expression of a woman who had seen everything over 25 years of practice and had developed the ability to look directly at the thing no one was naming without needing to name it herself. Is the extra 45 minutes productive? She asked. Yes, I said. Good, she said. And then, after a pause that was precisely as long as it needed to be meaningful, Sable. Yes. The Nexum case is an 18-month engagement. It is currently month 3. I know. 15 more months of joint strategy sessions at 45 minutes over. I looked at her. The math is what it is, I said. Gia nodded slowly. The kind of nod people make when they have said the thing they needed to say and are satisfied that it has been received. Come find me if anything changes, she said. Nothing changed. Everything continued to build. In July, Julian Park's team announced that the deposition phase would require a 2-week trip to Seattle, where Nexum's headquarters were located and where the bulk of the documentary evidence had been collected and where the majority of the key witnesses worked. It was a logistical necessity. Both legal teams would be housed at the same hotel, a neutral corporate property in downtown Seattle, 3 blocks from the Nexum offices, with a shared working space commandeered from the hotel's conference level for the duration. I packed for Seattle with the professional attention I brought to every road trip and thought about nothing except the depositions. Tace and I were on the same flight. This was Julian Park's logistics team being efficient rather than the universe making a point, but the universe, it had to be said, was not making a point. We were in adjacent seats in business class, which the Nexum retainer afforded, and which neither of us had requested or, apparently, had thought to change. I discovered this at the gate. Tace was already seated when I boarded, reading something on her tablet with the complete attention she brought to everything she read, and she looked up when I stopped at the row. They put you here, she said. Not a question. They put me here, I said. She moved her bag from the aisle seat to the overhead bin without making it an event. I sat down. We did not speak for the first hour. The flight was 5.5 hours, and the work was real, and we both had it, and the silence between us was the specific silence of 2 people who have developed the ability to be in a room together without filling the air. After an hour, she put her tablet down and looked at the middle distance in the way she looked at things when she was solving a problem that existed in the law rather than in the document. The witness sequence, she said. Park's financial officers first, I said. Work backward toward the board. I disagree. She did not say it harshly. She said it the way she said everything, clean and without apology. The board first. Establish the decision chain. Then the financial officers appear to have been following instructions rather than making them. The liability structure holds better. I thought about it. She watched me think about it, which I had noticed she always did not impatiently, but with the particular attention of someone who found the thinking as interesting as the conclusion. You are right, I said. She picked up her tablet again. A small pause. That was faster than usual, she said. I am working on it, I said. The corner of her mouth moved. 1 millimeter. I had not been expecting it. Seattle in July was gray. In the particular way coastal cities are gray, not oppressive, just layered. The morning fog burning off by 10 to leave the air clean and very still. The Nexum depositions were scheduled in 2-hour blocks across the working days, with the lunch breaks used for document review and the evenings for witness preparation. The hotel conference space had been divided into 2 working rooms, one for each team, with a shared corridor between them that saw a great deal of traffic. The depositions went well. Tace was exactly the litigator I had expected her to be. In a deposition room, the sequence question, the long pause before the follow-up, the specific redirect that arrived exactly when the witness thought the difficult moment had passed. I took notes on her technique the way I had been doing, in some internal running document, for 4 years. She did not take notes on mine, but I could feel when she was paying attention, which was always, and the feeling was not uncomfortable. On the 3rd evening, Felix Oren ordered dinner for both teams in the shared conference space. It was a logistical courtesy extended with the cheerful obliviousness of a 28-year-old associate who had not been in the deposition room long enough yet to feel the thing in the air between the 2 senior attorneys, and was therefore genuinely useful in creating the circumstances for it to breathe. We ate at the long conference table with 4 associates between us, and the work spread around us and the Seattle evening going dark through the tall windows. Tace was across from me rather than at the end of the table, which was different from the Prescott and Vail conference room geometry, and the table was narrow enough that the distance had a quality to it. I was aware of it the way I was aware of all of her peripherally, continuously, without the awareness becoming anything I intended to act on. The associates finished and dispersed in 1s and 2s. Felix gathered the food containers with the efficient helpfulness he brought to everything. Tace was reviewing a deposition transcript with a yellow highlighter, making precise marks at specific lines, not looking up. I said, "The CFO is going to have trouble with the 3rd exhibit," she said, without looking up. "I know." He paused on it today when he thought we were moving to the next topic. He thought we were finished. "We were not finished," I said. "No," she capped the highlighter. "We were not." Felix disappeared into the corridor with the food containers. The conference room was quiet. The hotel hum surrounded us, ventilation, the distant sound of an elevator, the particular acoustic of a large building after its day is over. Tace looked up from the transcript. The overhead lighting in the conference room was the particular clean white of working environments built for precision, and in it her face was very clear, the strong line of her jaw, the short hair, the gray eyes that catalogued and disclosed nothing. She looked at me for 1 measured second. "What is your read on the 4th witness?" she asked. "Cooperative but careful," I said. "She knows more than she is saying, and she knows that we know. The question is how much of the knowing is loyalty and how much is fear." "Fear of whom?" "Not Park. Not the board." I had been thinking about this. Someone lateral, another officer, someone whose exposure connects to hers. Tace was quiet for a moment, processing. "That is not in the document record," she said. "No," I said. "It is in the way she looked at the door 3 times during the 1-hour deposition. She studied me." The studying was the specific, attentive version she used when she had encountered something she had not predicted. "How many times have you noticed something that was not in the document record?" she said. "And been right?" "I have not kept a precise count." "Approximate." "More than half the time," I said. She nodded once. Like a decision being made. "We adjust the 4th deposition," she said. "Go lateral on the relationship questions." "Yes." She gathered the transcript and the highlighter, and her phone from the table. She stood. She was not a small woman, not tall in the way that reads as imposing, but tall in the way that reads as present, as someone who occupied exactly the space they were standing in without excess or apology. "Good night, Ren," she said. "Good night," I said. She left. I sat in the conference room for a while longer and looked at the Seattle evening through the windows and thought about the sound of my name in her mouth, which was something I was developing a specific sensitivity to, and which I was going to have to stop developing or decide what to do with. The thing happened on the fourth evening. I had been working late in the conference room alone, finishing a document outline I had started at lunch and not been able to close out during the afternoon session. It was nearly 11. The hotel was quiet in the way hotels get when midnight approaches, not empty, just settled, the transactional energy of a day at rest. I gathered my materials, shut down the laptop, turned off the conference room lights, and went into the corridor. Tace was in the corridor. She was standing at the window at the far end of the hall, a tall window that looked out over the downtown Seattle lights, the Space Needle in the distance behind the low fog, the street below glowing amber. She was in dark trousers and a white shirt, sleeves rolled at the forearm, no jacket, and she was not looking at a document or a phone. She was looking at the city. I stopped. She heard me stop. She turned. The corridor was not narrow, but it was narrower than the conference room. The window light and the hallway ambient light mixed into something that was neither the working white of the conference rooms nor quite the dark of the rest of the hotel. She looked at me across it. "You are working late," she said. "You are standing in a hotel hallway," I said. "I know." A pause. The elevator hummed somewhere in the building. "I could not close out the outline," I said. "The witness sequence," she said, not a question. "The fourth deposition." "Yes." She turned back to the window. Not a way turned to include the window in the conversation, the way people turn to look at something they want the other person to also be looking at. "I have been thinking about what you said," she said. "The lateral relationship, the fear that is not about the obvious people. And I think you are right. And I think the reason I had not found it in the document record is that I was reading the record as a record instead of as evidence of something the record was designed not to contain." I came down the corridor toward her. Not all the way. Far enough that the window was included in my sightline too, the Seattle lights doing their quiet work below the fog. "That is a generous reading of why you missed it," I said. "It is an accurate one," she said. "You could also say, you trusted the document record too much." "That is also accurate," she said. "Both things can be true." I looked at the city. She was beside me, not quite close enough to be the kind of close that required a decision, but close enough that the distance had a quality to it. The Space Needle caught the amber light through the fog. A city going about its night around us with complete indifference. "What are you actually standing in this hallway thinking about?" I asked. A very long pause. The fog moved over the city lights. She said, "The contact in my phone that is saved as Sable." I did not move. She said, "I noticed I had saved it that way when I was looking for Felix's number 3 weeks ago. I could not remember saving it that way. I had been thinking about when I did." The city was very quiet from this height. "I was in my office," she said, "in March. The day Julian Park's team called to propose the co-counsel arrangement. March. I thought about March. About the Thursday afternoon when Gia had told me, and I had opened my phone and saved her name in the specific, abbreviated way I save things when I am not being careful. "I saved yours as Tace," I said. She turned her head and looked at me. In the mixed window light, her face was doing something it did not do in the conference room, or the courtroom, or the deposition room. Not soft, open. "In March," I said. "Before we had exchanged contact information," she said. "Before I had any professional reason to have it." "Yes," she said. The word yes, in that corridor, was its own sentence, and its own confession, and its own territory that neither of us had yet decided to enter. I looked at the city. She looked at the city. The Space Needle caught the amber light through the fog, and the fog held everything at a particular diffuse distance. She said, "I do not think I know what to do with this." "I know," I said. "The engagement runs through verdict." "I know. That is 15 more months, approximately," I said. She exhaled, very controlled. The exact breath of someone keeping something contained by will rather than by absence. "I should say good night," she said. "You should," I said. She did not say good night. She stood in the corridor for one more long moment, the city below us, the fog doing what fog does, and then she turned toward me, not all the way, just enough that I was in her field of vision, rather than the window. She said, "I have been thinking about the Meridian case. You sent me the derivative analysis 3 months ago," I said. "I sent it because the structure was useful for Nexum, and?" A pause. One of her pauses, the kind that had the real answer inside it. "And because it was the closest I could come," she said, "to saying that I have reviewed that case a number of times in the last 4 years, and that I am not entirely certain the ruling was correct." The corridor was very still. "You won," I said. "I know. You won by a legal argument that was technically correct." "I know," she said. "That is not the same as being right." I looked at her. This woman who had beaten me 4 years ago and had apparently spent parts of those 4 years finding that the winning had its own complications. Who had sent me a 6-year-old case exhibit via text message rather than through channels, because the direct route is the one you take when the message is really about something else. Who was standing in a hotel corridor in Seattle at 11 at night telling me, in the specific fractured language of someone who did not have a more direct language available, that the rivalry had cost her something too? "Good night, Morrow," I said. She said, "Good night." I went to my room. I lay on the hotel bed for a long time, the Seattle lights making their patterns through the window sheer, and I thought about the word saved, about the specific way you save something when you are not being careful. About the 4 years of measuring, and the 6-year-old exhibit sent direct, and the 15 months that remained in a case that was going to require us to keep being in the same rooms. I thought about what she had said about Meridian, about the ruling being correct and not right, about the difference between the two. I had known that difference for 4 years. I had not known she knew it too. The morning in Seattle after the corridor was ordinary in the way of mornings, when something has shifted and both parties have decided, temporarily, to let it be ordinary. I was at the hotel breakfast at 7. Tace arrived at 7:14, which I knew because I was looking at the doorway when she came in, which I was not going to spend time examining. She got coffee. She sat at the table across the room from me, which was the table closest to the electrical outlet for her laptop, which was a coincidence of electrical geography rather than a statement. She did not look up when she sat down. I did not look up from my document review. The hotel breakfast traffic moved around us with the efficient neutrality of people who had their own work and their own mornings and no investment in ours. At 7:40, she crossed the room and set a small dish of pastries at the corner of my table without stopping or sitting or saying anything, and continued to the coffee station for her second cup. I looked at the pastries. They were the almond ones, which were the ones I had taken both previous mornings. She had noticed. She had not said anything about noticing. She had simply executed on the information. I ate one of the pastries and thought about what it meant to be known in the specific way that involves someone paying attention to what you take at a hotel breakfast, and I did not arrive at a conclusion that was comfortable. The fourth deposition was the afternoon of the same day. We had restructured the approach based on my read on the fourth witness, Kasara Lim, Nexum's chief people officer, who had been in the room for every relevant board meeting, and whose document record was conspicuously less detailed than everyone else's. The restructuring required a specific lateral question sequence that would need to come from Tace's examination rather than mine, because Tace had built the early examination framework, and changing examiners mid-deposition was a disruption that created credibility risk. We went over the sequence in the conference room at noon. Tace listened to the full approach, asked 3 precise clarifying questions, and agreed with the strategy in a sentence. Then she ran through it twice to make sure the pivot from the documented record to the lateral relationship questions would be invisible to the witness. It was invisible. Kasara Lim answered the lateral questions before she understood they were lateral questions, which is the only way to get answers to the questions a witness has been instructed not to answer. What she disclosed in the last 20 minutes of a 2-hour deposition was the most useful single record in the case. Tace ended the deposition. She capped her pen. She looked at me across the deposition room table and said nothing, but her eyes said something, and I had been reading the specific vocabulary of her eyes long enough to know what it said. It said, "You were right." Felix Oren drove back to the hotel from the Nexum offices and spent the journey detailing his notes to his recorder with the thorough, earnest energy of a young attorney who had just been in the best room of his legal career so far. Tace sat in the front seat reading the transcript on her phone and made no comment on Felix's running narration. I sat in the back and watched the Seattle evening go by. The last 2 days of the deposition trip were procedurally clean and strategically complete, and neither Tace nor I referenced the corridor or the city below, or the contact saved as Tace or as Sable, or anything that had happened between 11 and 11:30 on a Tuesday night in a hotel hallway. We were entirely professional. The professional was not a lie. It was also not the complete picture. On the flight back to New York, she sat in the window seat, and I had the aisle different from the flight out, and she slept for the first 3 hours, which I knew because I looked over twice, and her breathing was the different, slower kind, and the tablet had locked itself in her hands. She was a very still sleeper. It was not information I needed. I had it anyway. She woke up 2 hours outside of New York and opened the tablet and worked. An hour from landing, she said, without preamble. The bar committee is reviewing co-counsel arrangements this quarter. Margot Vale flagged it. Margot Vale was the senior partner at Prescott & Vale, the institutional pressure in its most formal configuration. What is the review scope? I asked. Ethics compliance on joint engagements, standard review. It is procedural, but Margot wants all joint matters documented by end of October. Gia will want the same. Yes. Does the review cover the strategy sessions? A pause. Not a long one. It covers all joint activity. I thought about the strategy sessions, about the 45-minute overruns, about 3 texts sent direct rather than through channels, about pastries at a breakfast table. Then we make sure the documentation is clean, I said. Yes, she said. She went back to the tablet. I looked at the cloud cover outside the window, the city below just beginning to appear in the gaps, and thought about the word clean, about documentation, and the things it contained and the things it did not. We landed at 7 in the evening. By 8, I was at my desk at Harwick and Stern with the Seattle transcripts and a 2-hour window before anyone expected anything of me, and I was not thinking about the corridors or the pastries or the contact saved as Tace. I was absolutely thinking about all 3. What I knew about myself. By the time I was sitting at my desk at 8:15 that evening, with the Seattle transcripts and the lamp making its small circle of light, and the building otherwise quiet around me, was that I had been paying attention to Tace Morrow for 4 years in the specific way you pay attention to a problem you have not yet solved. And that at some point in the last 7 months, without fully marking the transition, the nature of the paying attention had changed. It was no longer about the law. It had not been only about the law for some time. I opened the case file and worked until 11. It was the most productive 2.5 hours I had had in a month. This was also information. Gia found me at 9 the next morning. She came to the doorway of my office with a coffee she had clearly made herself rather than ordered, which meant she was staying and wanted to talk. Seattle, she said. Good trip, I said. The 4th deposition was significant. I read Felix's summary. She sat down. He was very thorough. He also noted that the restructuring of the 4th deposition approach was proposed by you and executed by Morrow, and that the combination produced the most useful witness disclosure in the case to date. That is accurate. Felix has good instincts, Gia said. He also has the specific obliviousness of someone who is very focused on the work and occasionally misses the other thing. What other thing? I said. Gia looked at me. For a woman of 25 years' practice, she had a very patient face. Sable, she said. I know, I said. Tell me what I need to know. I told her what I needed her to know, which was the version of the truth that fit inside the professional frame, and was still true. I told her the co-counsel arrangement was functioning, and the case was on track, and the joint sessions had been productive in excess of projected billings, and I believed we would win. And the rest? Gia asked. Is being managed, I said. By both of you? By both of us. Gia considered that. She turned her coffee cup in her hands, a habit she had when she was deciding something. 15 months, she said. I know. 15 months of managed, she said. That is a long time to manage something. I know that too. She looked at me for a moment longer. Then she set the coffee down and stood. I am here, she said. When managed stops being the full story, come find me. She left. I sat with my document review and my Seattle transcripts and the knowledge that managed was not going to be the full story indefinitely, and that the person I needed to discuss the transition with was not Gia. Drew Calloway reached out in September. The email was professional and brief. She covered the legal business beat for a major publication and was writing a feature on the Nexum case as a study in co-counsel litigation strategy, specifically the unusual client-mandated joint engagement model. She had requested interviews with both lead attorneys. Would I be available for 30 minutes? I forwarded the request to Tace. Tace's response arrived in 4 minutes. Fine with the interview. Suggest we speak with her jointly rather than separately. Cleaner messaging. I agreed. We met with Drew Calloway at a neutral location, a hotel conference room that Drew had secured for the purpose, which felt appropriately liminal for a conversation we were all managing in slightly different ways. Drew Calloway was 34 and had the easy, grounded attention of someone who listened to people for a living and had learned that the space between what people said and what they meant was where the actual story lived. She was not the kind of journalist who filled silences. She held them, waiting to see what grew. She asked the expected questions first. The structure of the co-counsel arrangement, the strategic value of combining two firms' approaches, the challenges of joint litigation management. Tace answered these with the precise efficiency she brought to anything public, and I answered with the specific detail that Tace's efficiency left room for. Drew wrote things down and let us talk. Then she looked up from her notes and said, very calmly, "You two have been on opposite sides of litigation before." "Meridian," Tace said. 4 years ago. "What changed?" Drew asked. "In the dynamic. What made the adversarial register shift to collaborative?" A pause. Brief. The kind Tace used before the real answer. "The work required it," Tace said. "Is that the full answer?" Drew asked. Another pause. Not as brief. "It is the professional one," Tace said. Drew looked at me. I met her eyes. She held the look for a moment that was a question without the shape of a question. "You have been watching each other for 4 years," Drew said. "Not to either of us specifically, to the space between us." That kind of sustained professional attention tends to produce information. It produces understanding of legal strategy, Tace said. "That too," Drew said. She capped her pen. She looked at both of us with the clean, unbothered kindness of someone who had arrived at the answer she came for and was not going to make anyone uncomfortable by saying it. "I have what I need for the feature. Thank you both." She stood. She shook our hands. She was almost at the door when she stopped and turned back briefly. The way people turn back when they have decided to give you the most useful thing they have. "Off the record," she said, looking at neither of us and both of us. "The most interesting thing in the room today was what you did not say. I will not put it in the piece, but I would think about it." She left. The conference room was very quiet. "She is good," I said. "Yes," Tace said. "What did we not say?" She picked up her pen from the table and slid it into the inner pocket of her jacket. She looked at the door Drew had just walked out of. "I think," she said, carefully, "that was the point." I looked at her. She looked at the door. Then she looked at me. "We have the depositions of the financial officers next week," she said. "We do," I said. She gathered her materials and left. I sat in the neutral conference room and thought about what the space between what people say and what they mean contains, and how long you can live in that space before it becomes the most important place in the room. 3 days after the Drew Calloway interview, there was a strategy session at Harwick and Stern. Tace arrived alone. Felix had a conflict on another matter, and the conference room felt different for his absence, in the way rooms feel different when the person who had been making the arrangement feel normal is no longer there to make it feel normal. We worked for 2 hours on the damages exhibit sequence and a timeline graphic for the jury display. Tace had brought revisions to the graphic that were precisely correct and that I had not thought of, which I told her, And she nodded in the brief way she nodded when a professional compliment landed correctly, and she did not know a better response to it than honest acknowledgement. At the end of the session, when I was copying files to the shared drive and she was organizing the physical exhibits into a binder with the careful economy she brought to everything physical, she said without looking up what Drew said, about what we did not say. "Yes," I said. "I have been thinking about it." "So have I." A pause. She aligned the last exhibit tab and closed the binder. "I do not think there is a professional solution," she said. "To the thinking." "No," I said. "I do not think there is either." She picked up the binder. She looked at me for one honest second. Then she said, "I will see you Thursday," and left. I sat in the conference room in the specific silence that follows a conversation that has said more by not saying it than most conversations manage at full volume. I thought about what Drew had seen in 30 minutes that we had been refusing to name for 7 months. I thought about the space between what people say and what they mean, and how long you can live in that space before the space becomes the only thing you are actually inside. October arrived, and with it, the bar committee's review notice, the financial officer depositions, and the specific tightening of the professional frame that happens when institutional attention is pointed at an arrangement that has been functioning outside the margins of the frame. The review was procedural. It was also genuinely consequential, because the documentation of the joint sessions revealed the 45-minute overruns and the text sent direct, rather than through channels, and the specific pattern of a co-counsel arrangement that had been operating with a degree of personal investment that the institutional record did not entirely account for. Margot Vale requested a meeting with Tace. I knew about it because Tace told me, the same evening, in the parking structure outside the Harwick and Stern building, which was not where she would have come to tell me if this were a purely professional communication. "Margot wants a written accounting of the joint session hours," she said, "and an explanation of the 3 direct contacts." "The texts," I said. "Yes." "What did you tell her?" "That the direct contacts were related to specific document requests that the case timeline required, which is technically accurate for 2 of them." "And the third?" A pause in the parking structure, the specific ambient of a half-empty concrete space with the sound of the city above and the yellow utility light, doing nothing flattering to either of us. "The third," she said, "is harder to explain technically." The third text had been from October, 2 weeks before. It had said, "The limb deposition your read was right in the way that mattered." I should have said so at the time. I had saved it. I had read it 3 times. "What are you going to tell Margot?" I asked. "The truth," she said. "That the contact was professional in content, and that the channel was non-standard, and that I am documenting it now." "And if she asks why the channel was non-standard?" She looked at me in the parking structure light. The light there was the particular utilitarian yellow of spaces not designed for conversation, and it made her face very clear, in the way that light which does not try to flatter tends to make things clear. "I do not think she will ask," she said. "Margot is very good at knowing the answer to a question before she asks it, and deciding whether she wants the answer on the record. Is that good or bad for us?" "It depends," she said, "on what you mean by us." The word us sat in the parking structure between us. She said, "I should go." "Tace?" I said. She stopped. "The limb deposition," I said. "Thank you for the text. You were right that you should have said so at the time." A very long pause. She said, "I have wanted to say a number of things at a number of times that I said differently or did not say." "I know," I said. "I am aware that you know," she said. "I find that more difficult to manage than the other things." She left. I stood in the parking structure and thought about the word manage. About the things that resist management no matter how good the manager. About 45-minute overruns and pastries at a hotel breakfast and a text sent, because the direct route is the one you take when the message is really about something else. I went back to my office. The building was quiet by then, late enough that the late stayers had gone home, and early enough that the early arrivers had not yet come in. I sat at my desk in the lamp circle and thought about the word insufficient. about what it meant that the most composed attorney I had ever shared a room with had used that word to describe the professional frame she had built over 4 years to hold the other thing. A frame she had constructed with the same care and precision she brought to a trial strategy. One that had held for 4 years. One that had, apparently, been showing cracks since the first April session and had definitively failed in a hotel corridor in Seattle in July, and had been maintained since then on something thinner than what had built it. The word insufficient, spoken in a parking structure under fluorescent utility light, was the most honest thing she had said to me since the Meridian derivative analysis sent by direct text in April. The analysis that said, "I am reaching. This is the form the reach takes when I am not yet able to take another form." I had known. I had been knowing, with the specific clarity you develop when someone you have been paying attention to for 4 years starts paying attention back, for most of the last 7 months. I had been letting it be known without named, because the naming required both of us to decide what to do with it, and the engagement ran through verdict, and the math was what it was. But she had told me, in November, with a parking structure and a yellow utility light between us, that the management was failing. And I had told her to go tell Margot. Because honest solutions that cost something real are the only solutions I have ever been able to respect, which is what my father, the labor attorney, meant when he said that the difference between correct and right was the most important distinction in law. The moment of the breaking point was not the one I had predicted. The Nexum case had its difficult month in November. A new filing by opposing counsel challenged the damages framework on technical grounds that were partially sound and required a rapid response. Julian Park called a crisis meeting. Both firms sent their full teams. The conference room at Nexum's New York satellite office was full, and Julian Park was the specific kind of difficult client that crisis made more difficult, and the room needed someone to take the liability and stabilize the strategy and present the counter-argument with the clean authority of someone who had already solved the problem. Tace stood up first. She presented the counter-argument with the unhurried precision I had watched her deploy in depositions and courtrooms and strategy sessions for 7 months. It was exactly right. It addressed every dimension of the technical challenge, and it held. And then Julian Park, who was the specific kind of difficult client who needed to feel like the solution was partly his, said, "What was the original recommendation on the damages structure? Whose call was that?" The room went quiet. The original damages framework had been my recommendation. I had argued for the stratified model based on Tace's analysis, and we had jointly adopted it, but the original articulation had been mine, in a strategy session documented in the joint record. I started to answer. Tace said, "The damages structure was a joint recommendation. The stratified model came from Prescott and Vale's analysis." She said it with the same unhurried precision she used for everything. She looked at Julian Park, and not at me. "The challenge we are facing is a technical challenge to a sound structure, not a strategic error. The distinction matters for the response approach." Julian Park accepted it. The meeting moved forward. I sat in the Nexum conference room and understood what had just happened. She had taken the structure into her firm's column. She had, in front of clients and senior partners and the full assembled team, absorbed the liability for a decision that had been mine in order to protect the strategic credibility of our joint approach at the moment it needed to be most credible. She had not asked me. She had not looked at me while she did it. She had simply done it with the specific, economic certainty of someone who had made a decision before the meeting started and was executing it. After the meeting, in the Nexum corridor, I stopped her. "What did you do?" I asked. "What the moment required," she said. "You took the liability for my decision." "I took the liability for our decision," she said. "The record supports that framing, and it was the correct strategic move in that room. Margot Vale is going to ask you about it." "Yes," she said. "What are you going to tell her?" She looked at me. In the Nexum corridor, with the November afternoon through the tall windows behind her and the sound of the dispersing meeting in the background, she looked very tired. Not the tired of exhaustion, but the tired of someone who has been holding something for a long time and has arrived at the moment of deciding whether to keep holding it. "The truth," she said, that it was the right call for the case. And if she asks the rest of it, I will tell her the rest of it, she said. I should have told her the rest of it in October. I stared at her. You are going to disclose, I said. I should have disclosed 3 months ago, she said. The bar review made it clear. The direct texts, the session hours. The pattern is visible to anyone who reads the documentation carefully, and I would rather it be visible because I made it so than because a committee did. What does disclosure mean for you? She looked at me steadily. The way she had looked at the city from the hotel window in Seattle, toward the thing, not away from it. A formal review by the bar's ethics committee, she said. Possible suspension from the Nexum engagement, a restructuring of the co-counsel arrangement. You would lose the Nexum lead. I would lose the Nexum lead, she said. Yes. I looked at her. The most dangerous litigator in the city, and she was going to walk into Margot Vale's office and tell the truth about the 3 texts and the 45-minute session overruns and the pattern that was visible to anyone who read the documentation carefully, because it was the right thing to do, and she had decided at some point between October and November that being right was more important than being safe. Why? I asked. I needed her to say it. She looked at me for a long time. Because the rivalry was never only about the law, she said. The corridor was very still. Say the rest of it, I said. A pause. One of her pauses, the kind with the real answer inside it. I have been aware of you, she said, in ways that exceed what the professional record accounts for most of the 4 years since Meridian. I have been managing that awareness inside the professional frame. The frame has become insufficient, and the only thing I know how to do about insufficiency is to account for it honestly. The most important word in that sentence was the second one, been. Since Meridian, I said. Since the summary judgment phase, she said. I watched you rebuild the theory from nothing. It was the best lawyering I had seen anyone do and lose. I won the case and I drove home and thought about your damages brief for 3 hours. You won, I said. I know I won, she said. Winning is not the only information available. I looked at her. She said, the rivalry was the only language I had for it. For all 4 years. I was on the opposite side of every case, and I could not say the thing out loud, so I said it in the way I knew, by being the opposition that required you to be your best, by staying where the argument was. I understood, in the Nexum corridor, something I had not fully put together. All 4 years of measuring. All 4 years of the Meridian brief opened and reread. All 4 years of the rival who had been the most interesting person in the room. I said, you sent me the derivative analysis in April. Yes. Through text. Direct. Yes. The first thing you ever sent me directly, I said, was the evidence of the case you won against me. She was quiet. That is, I said, a very specific kind of statement. Yes, she said, it is. The corridor. The November afternoon. The case moving forward in every room around us. Go tell Margot, I said. She looked at me. Go tell Margot, I said again. And when the review is over and the arrangement is restructured and you are no longer co-counsel lead on this case, call me. She said, Sable. Call me, I said. She held my eyes for one long, open second. Then she nodded. She went. I did not sleep well. This was not unusual for the night after a major decision, but this was not a major decision I had made. It was a major decision being made by someone else, about something that implicated me, and the specific quality of lying awake waiting for the morning was different from the quality of lying awake about your own choices. Her choices were not mine to make. Her choices were the most direct evidence available of what she had decided to do with the thing she had been managing for 4 years, and the decision was to stop managing it privately, and put it in the institutional record, and pay whatever the record required. She had called it insufficient. She had said the management had failed. She had said it in November. With her back against the corridor wall, and the full weight of the Nexum engagement, and the bar review, and Margot Vale's scrutiny pressing from every institutional direction, and she had said it anyway. I thought about that until 3 in the morning, and then I stopped thinking and went to sleep. She disclosed to Margot Vale the following morning. The ethics review was formally initiated. The co-counsel arrangement was restructured. Tace remained available in an advisory capacity at Prescott and Vale's discretion, but the lead representation transferred to another senior litigator at the firm. The case continued. We reached trial in the spring with a damages framework and a witness record that would have been impossible without the 7 months of joint work. I continued on the Nexum matter through the spring. Tace was not in the deposition rooms or the conference rooms or the strategy sessions. The new Prescott and Vale lead was a competent senior litigator named Harlow Stearns, who was thorough and technically sound, and whose approach to the case was, at every turn, precisely what you would expect and nothing beyond. She was good at her job, the job proceeded. What Harlow could not supply was the specific resistance. The 45-minute overrun because a legal argument had opened into something more interesting, and neither of us wanted to stop. The text at 11 at night about a detail in an exhibit that was technically a work question and was actually something else. The specific quality of being in a room with someone whose disagreement cost you something because it was always precise and was therefore always worth the cost. I ran the case the way Tace had taught me to run it, which was not the same as saying I ran it the way she would have. It was the same legal framework and the same witness record and the same damages model and a different person at the helm. I made the closing argument in April to a jury of 8 and thought, during the third exhibit reference, about the conversation we had had on a flight to Seattle in July, about whether to go to the board first or the financial officers, and how quickly she had said, I disagree, and how quickly, that time, she had been right. Tace was, in some background frequency, always in the room. The arguments I had built out of our disagreements, the witness read that had changed the fourth deposition, the stratified model and the specific legal precision that had made it defensible. I won the case in the spring. Tace had built the legal structure that made the win possible and was not there to see it. I sat in the courthouse hallway after the verdict for a while. Not long there were things to do, calls to make, Julian Park's team to brief. But long enough to sit with the specific quality of winning something together with someone who was not present, which is its own kind of accounting. The case had been built in 2 rooms before it was built in 1. That was not going to be in any filing. I called Gia from the courthouse steps. The February air was cold and the city was moving the way cities move in the afternoon, when most of what is going to happen has already happened and the rest is paperwork. Well done, she said. The model held, I said. I know. I read the verdict summary. The model held and the witness record held and the closing argument was the best you have given in 4 years. Julian Park's team has already sent a preliminary satisfaction note. The retainer language for a follow-on engagement will be in your inbox by end of day. The model was... I stopped. I know whose model it was, Gia said, quietly, without judgment. I also know whose closing argument it was. Both things are true. Go celebrate, Sable. You earned the win. I did not celebrate. I went back to the office and worked for 2 hours and then went home and ate dinner alone and thought about the verdict and about what it felt like to win a case that was partly someone else's blueprint and partly your own best. Lawyering and entirely the product of 7 months of arguing. About something you both believed in. I called her the day after the verdict. She answered on the second ring. Her voice was the same level. Precise, itself. I saw the news, she said. The damages model held on appeal, I said. I know. Your model, I said. A pause. Not as long as her usual pauses. Our model, she said. Yes, I said. Our model. Are you available for dinner? Another pause. Shorter. Yes, she said. We met at a restaurant in the West Village that was loud enough to be anonymous and old enough to have the specific dignity of places that have no reason to perform their importance. She was there when I arrived, in a dark blazer and a silk shirt the color of deep water, her hair, as it always was, close-cropped, herself, and she stood when she saw me, and did not give me the professional nod she gave to everyone in rooms she was managing. She just stood and waited. I sat down across from her. She said, Congratulations. I said, Thank you for the model. She said, You won it. I said, I built on what you gave me. She looked at me across the table. The restaurant moved around us, other people's evenings and conversations creating the specific privacy of public spaces. She said, I want to tell you the thing I said in November more completely. The rivalry being the only language, I said. Yes. She held my eyes. I want to be more direct about what the language was covering. Then be direct, I said. She set her hands flat on the table. The small gold chain at her collar caught the candlelight the way it always caught light briefly, honestly, without announcement. She said, I have been in love with you since the summary judgment phase of a securities case 4 years ago that I should not have won the way I won it, and I have been managing that fact for 4 years inside the only professional framework available to me, and the framework has been, for much of that time, insufficient. The restaurant moved around us. I said, the framework was occasionally very frustrating. She said, I know, I am sorry. I said, saying you managed it as opposition for 4 years is the most dramatic love confession I have ever received. The corner of her mouth moved, more than 1 millimeter, something genuine and unguarded. It is not efficient, she said. No, I said, it is not. I reached across the table and put my hand over hers. Her hands were warm and still, and she turned the right one so that her palm was against mine. I saved your name in March, I said, before we had any professional reason to exchange contacts. I did not understand why I did it for 7 months. I understand why I did it, she said. I understood at the time. That was the problem. That you understood. That I understood and chose to call it a professional contact anyway. I looked at her. Tace Morrow, who had been the most interesting person in every room for 4 years, who had won against me and sent me the evidence of the win as the first honest thing she ever gave me directly, who had stood in a hotel corridor in Seattle and told me that the ruling was correct but not right, and that both things could be true. I said, have you finished managing it? She looked at me. She said, I have been trying to stop managing it since November. How is that going? Slowly, she said. I have a very developed capacity for management. I know, I said. I have watched it for 4 years. She turned her hand so that our fingers could settle together properly. Not a claim, not a destination. The beginning of something that had been held at distance for 4 years by professional languages and direct texts and 45-minute session overruns and pastries at a hotel breakfast and a contact saved as Tace in March. Before either of us had a reason to have it. I said, the Nexum case is concluded. She said, yes. I said, we are not co-counsel. She said, we are not anything professionally. I said, that opens a significant amount of room. She said, I have been thinking about the room. I said, what have you been thinking? She looked at me across the table with those gray eyes that had catalogued everything for 4 years and had, over the last several months, gradually stopped withholding. She said, that I would like to be in it with you, without the framework, without management, with the full accounting. I said, that is the most legally precise romantic statement I have ever heard. She laughed, short and genuine and unguarded, the kind of laugh I had not heard from her in a courtroom or a deposition room or a strategy session or a hotel corridor. The kind that existed on the other side of all the management. I thought about 4 years. About the Meridian brief, reviewed 6 times. About the weight of a rivalry that had been the only language available for something that had no other language. About the things that resist management no matter how good the manager. I thought about being found, across 4 years of opposition, by someone who had been looking from the other side. I said, dinner. And then whatever comes after dinner. She said, yes. We stayed for 3 hours. The restaurant cycled through 2 seatings around us and we did not notice either of them, which told us both something. We talked about law first, about the Nexum verdict and the parts of the damages model that had held under cross-examination, and the one witness redirect in the closing stretch that had cost us almost nothing and bought the verdict the margin it needed. She had followed the proceedings from a distance, through the public filings and through Harlow's obligatory update calls, and she had done so with the same level of investment she brought to everything, which meant she had an opinion about the redirect and said so plainly. And I told her she was right and she told me she knew, and neither of us said anything about the fact that she had not been in the room. And then we talked about the 4 years of measuring and what the measuring had produced beyond the wins and losses. and what it felt like to be on opposite sides of something for so long that opposing became the available language for the other thing. She was more direct about it now than she had been about anything over the full 18 months of the engagement. The management was down. Whatever had been holding the real version at distance had been discharged in November, and what remained was simply the true account. And then we talked about other things. About her knee surgery at 32 from a decade of competitive swimming she never mentioned in professional contexts. About my father, who was a labor attorney in Philadelphia, and who had taught me that the difference between correct and right was the most important distinction in law. About the specific gravity of the gold chain at her collar, and the history it carried, which she told me plainly when I asked a gift from her mother, worn since the year she passed the bar. The weight of it on certain kinds of days, a form of continuity she did not need to explain further, and did not. When we left, she held the door, and outside on the November pavement, she put her hands in her pockets and looked at me with the composure that was real and the openness she had been learning how to sustain. I said, "You are going to call me tomorrow." She said, "I was going to text." I said, "Call." She said, "Is this already a precedent?" I said, "You said you would think about being in the room. This is what being in the room looks like." She was quiet for a moment. The city moved around us, cabs and foot traffic, and the November cold doing its honest work on everything it touched. She said, "Sable." I said, "Yes." She looked at me for one long, honest second. Then she took one of her hands out of her pocket and held it out open-palmed, nothing more than that, the specific gesture of someone who had been precise about everything for 4 years and had decided that precision, this once, could be small and still be enough. I took her hand. We stood on the November pavement like that for a long moment, the city going on around us with its complete indifference to anything that had just resolved itself outside a restaurant in the West Village. And I thought about what it cost to wait for the right version of something instead of taking the available version. And I thought that this was the specific quality of things that have been earned by everything that came before them, not frantic, not announced, just finally and exactly present. 3 months later, I was in court arguing a motion in a case that had nothing to do with Nexum and everything to do with a legal theory I had been refining since the Meridian defeat 4 years ago. Tace was in the gallery. Not because she had any professional reason to be there. Because she had read the brief I had shared with her over dinner the previous Tuesday, and had said, in the specific flat way she said things that were not flat at all, that she wanted to see the argument in the room. I stood at the lectern and I could feel her watching from the gallery the way I always could, complete, specific, the particular attention she paid to things she cared most about. I made the argument. I won the motion. Walking out of the courthouse into the February cold, she fell into step beside me. She said, "The third argument. The derivative contract analysis." I said, "Built on your 2019 exhibit." She said, "Better than my exhibit." I said, "I had better material to build from." She was quiet for a moment. The courthouse steps were cold marble under our feet, and the February air was direct and honest and very clear. She said, "I reviewed the Meridian record again last month." I said, "What did you find?" She said, "That you should have won, and that winning that case correctly, instead of technically, would have required the specific legal theory you just deployed in that courtroom." I stopped walking. She stopped with me. I said, "It only took 4 years and a co-counsel arrangement and approximately 9 direct text messages." She said, 8. One of them was from Felix. I said, "Tace." She said, "Yes." I said, "You were right about appeal risk and I was right about jury math, and neither of us would have built the thing alone." She looked at me. The gold chain at her collar caught the February light, the same way it caught every other light, briefly and without announcement. She said, "No, we would not have." I took her hand. We walked out from the courthouse steps and into the city that was cold and ongoing and entirely unconcerned with the 4 years we had spent on opposite sides of it, measuring each other across the full distance of everything that rivalry covers when it is the only language available for the thing underneath. The contact in my phone still said Tace. It had said that since March, before I had any professional reason to have it. From the moment I had saved it, without thinking, In the specific abbreviated way you save someone when you are not being careful. She was not careful either. She had saved mine as Sable. We had known. Neither of us had said so. For 4 years, and across every filing that named us on opposite sides of the same dispute, we had known. The depositions and the strategy sessions, and the hotel corridors and the parking structures, and the 45-minute overruns, and the 3 texts sent direct rather than through channels, all of it had been the language. Available when the real language was not available, which is the thing about rivalry that no one explains when they name it. It is not competition. It is intimacy without a container. It is 2 people making the only conversation they are allowed to have about the conversation they are not allowed to have. She had found a better language. It had cost her something real. She had paid it anyway. That was the accounting. That was the whole of it. Rivals do not save each other's numbers. So why did I save hers first? Because some things are not rivalries. Some things are just the only language left when the real word is too dangerous to say across a courtroom.